Welcome, everyone. My name is Mary Hartford. I work at ISA with the virtual events team. Today, we have with us Tom Deans, who is a professor of English at the University of Connecticut. He directs the Writing Center and serves as a co-PI on a grant exploring the uses of AI to support neurodiverse graduate writers in STEM. We are very lucky to have him here with us on this topic. There's a lot of excitement being generated right now. This is probably one of our best registered and already probably best attended virtual events in a long time. So I'm going to not waste any more of your time and let Tom go ahead.
Okay, welcome everyone. While I'm introducing myself, I'd kind of like for you to introduce yourselves. So I'm going to share a screen here, but I'm also hoping that you'll put the chat open in your own and that you will just do a quick introduction of yourself so we get a sense of who's kind of in the virtual room here with us locally here where I am in Storrs, Connecticut, and perhaps far flung from Storrs. My pleasure to be here. I've never done one of these for ISA before, so as the newcomer, I appreciate the welcome and the invitation. As Mary said, I teach here at the University of Connecticut, where I've been since 2005, so going on a little more than 15 years. And my work in terms of my own research is not in computer science, so you can't really count on me to talk to you about the technologies that are under the hood with AI. But they are in writing studies and thinking about writing programs and thinking specifically about writing across the disciplines and how writers learn and grow even when they shuttle between academic and, say, social justice organizations or nonprofits. So that's where my research life has been. More and more recently, I've been doing work in STEM writing, interviewing students about how they develop as STEM writers. I've edited a series on writing across the disciplines, including a volume in political science from Oxford around thinking about how to actually coach student writers, especially in advanced writing courses. And I just work every day, with faculty at the kind of back end of our writing center here is faculty development, because we have a writing intensive course program for the UConn participants know well about that. And at the front end of the writing center, I coach undergraduates to work with fellow writers. So lots of thinking about writing. And as Mary suggested, I kind of got about a 6-month head start on thinking about ChatGPT before it all blew up publicly in November with the arrival, moving from GPT technologies that were a little harder to access to ChatGPT, which was really widely accessible to everyone and had a pretty low threshold for participation. The reason I had a head start was not because I've been thinking explicitly about technology and writing as part of my own research for decades. It's more because I was invited into that NSF project with Arash Zaghi in engineering to think about supporting neurodiverse writers. So that's been the particular angle I've been thinking about this, although it's not really the angle I'm going to take today. Today, I'm going to put more on my hat of just talking to fellow faculty who are teaching writing in the context of your own courses, and may have thought and have a lot of experience to bring. So I'm hoping that it's not just me talking at you today. I'm going to ask that you use the chat pretty often to raise questions. And Mary and Kat and Josh are going to help me interrupt my presentation as we go along so that we can answer your questions. We can also deal with more of them at the end if you want to reserve them to the end, but please feel free to jump in. This was promoted not as a really formal presentation, but as interactive as we can make a webinar here so that it's relevant to your teaching lives and your research lives. And the other thing is that AI is moving so fast that it doesn't make as much sense to kind of say, this is what it is in one singular static kind of way. I'm going to kind of share with you kind of in real time just how one faculty member is working with these questions around even my immediate teaching of a summer class that I started last week, where these issues are already in play. So let's get going. So thank you for doing the introductions, and I appreciate the range of people coming to us from all over the place. California, Connecticut, all over the place. Great. London, perfect. Welcome to all of you. I really appreciate your attending, listening, and hopefully participating. Let's go. So the first thing I want to do is kind of ask a question of you, and we're going to run a quick poll that helps me understand a little bit more than just your geography, but what your sort of familiarity and fluency is with these AI tools. So we're going to run a poll just for about 30 seconds or so that asks you this question: how familiar are you with artificial intelligence writing tools? There's 5 potential answers there. So just pick the one that most approximates where you are. Great. We got some PhD students and high school teachers. That's wonderful. We got folks from Pakistan, Finland. Wonderful. Thanks. Okay, we're doing this poll. I hope everyone will participate. There are no wrong answers. There's only the answer that best approximates where you are. Okay. All right, let's just do 10 more seconds with that one, or now, perfect. And if you could share the results so I can see them and others can see them. Okay, so let's look at these polling numbers. Never heard of them, 2%. I've heard of such tools, but have never tried them, 26%. I've tried AI once or twice, but don't use them. So let's look at that collectively. We're already looking at 30, 40, 50, about 60% of the folks who are saying you don't use them occasionally or frequency. And those numbers break down by about 25% saying, 26% saying you use them occasionally. And look at that final one. Only about 9% of you use AI at this moment more regularly, as we're saying there. Okay, perfect. So that said, I'm always interested in terms of how most of us, it seems like as faculty here, line up with what students are doing, because there's a lot of lore of what students are doing with AI, and we don't know a whole lot. There's been some polls that are sort of informal, and we did one here at UConn just with a fairly small group, but about 300 students. I'm going to close the poll and show you what the UConn students, at least as of February, March of this year, are telling us. And one of the things you'll notice is that their numbers aren't that far off of what those numbers you just delivered were. 8% of them or so were saying that they were using AI regularly in their school or personal writing. And a good 40% had never tried it. I think that number has even probably gone down between February, March, and now. But remember, this was still 1, 2, 3, or 4 months after the big arrival of ChatGPT, which was November 30th, 2000 of this past year, 22, right? So even a few months after that, after all the hype, almost 70 to 80% of students were in those first 3 categories saying, I've either never heard of it, which is kind of strange, but never used it or tried to use it. And this wasn't me, like, this was totally anonymous, and it wasn't, no one was surveilling them. There's no reason for us to believe that they were lying on this poll. And these numbers have been pretty much confirmed with the classes I was teaching in springtime, where I was just talking informally with my students. Really, fewer than 10% at this moment are using these technologies regularly. Now this could all change by the time we get back in the fall, right? So I'm not putting too much stock in these numbers as being especially meaningful for us right now, except to say, I think we've got a window to think through AI technologies. And I don't think we should panic around saying, oh my gosh, 90% of our students are using these, and we run around asking what's going on. We did ask another question to the students, which was a little more predictive, like, how much do you think you're going to use them this semester? And that was referring to this past semester that we just finished, the spring of 2023. And those numbers aren't all that different. 40% are still saying extremely unlikely, and still we're only getting less than 10%. We're saying extremely likely, but that somewhat likely number kind of is creeping up there. So I think we can expect these numbers to change even by the fall, but I also think we have some time as teachers and course designers to think about how to advocate within our courses and institutions for how to use this tool well. All right, let's move forward from the numbers. And if folks have any surprises or want to share what they think the numbers are in their own institutions, that you're welcome to put that in the chat too, or if you've done any informal polling among your students, let me know if the numbers that the UConn students reported are anything close. So one of the things we know is that AI is not going away. And for those of you who are paying attention, you may have already seen announcements in the last month or two that Microsoft is already moving AI technologies into places like Microsoft Word and their enterprise sort of systems right now, which probably tells me that it's going to be in all our Word and Google Docs any kind of word processing program is probably going to see this sooner rather than later. I don't know about you, but just yesterday on some YouTube video I was watching, Grammarly was promoting sort of the boosted version of Grammarly, which is not just the usual grammar editor, but is using generative AI, the large language models, to actually say, like, here's how you can be more productive at work, creating more work emails quicker and generating ideas if you're in advertising. So even things that were more limited kinds of either grammar checking software or AI assisted sort of sentence level things are moving towards this more generative options. It's just going to be part of where we are. And those of you who use GPT knows that it itself is changing. And I can't say that I've sort of tested out a lot of GPT-4, but my friend Arash on that NSF project, he's like, it's awesome. He loves it. And GPT is going to be more and more integrated with web searches so that it won't actually have some of these characteristics that it has now, which is it's very bad at sort of dealing with very recent events. Because that's not part of the corpus that it's been trained on. So this is all to say that I don't know where AI is going, but it's going somewhere and it's not going away. I'd love if you know of any other emergent concerns or just where the technology, as you see it, as perhaps thinking about this from a more technological end, you're aware of that, pop that in the chat so that others can check that out, or you can put a link in there to places that are exciting about new developments. Today, I'm just going to assume kind of where we are now with a bit of looking forward, suggesting that this is only going to get better and it's only going to get more pervasive. I'm not going to talk a little bit too much today about how AI works, but I think it's worth at least giving the most rough, basic sense of this. Because as I suggested, I'm not a computer scientist. I'm an English professor, so you can extrapolate from there how much I know about what's happening under the hood of my laptop. Not much, but I have been at least training myself to think about the basics of this. And that word "train" is used in a particular way in AI models. So these models are trained on an enormous corpus of texts. Thus, the word "large language models." Or LLMs. And I'm going to kind of use today LLMs, large language models, generative AI, and ChatGPT, those kind of 5 terms. I'm just going to use them kind of interchangeably, even though I know that there are some subtle and sometimes important differences for computer scientists among those. But what we need to know about the large language models like ChatGPT is that the model breaks down words and even subwords into tokens. And then it figures out the probability between all these tokens based on that large corpus of work that it's scraped from the web and from the New York Times and from every Reddit sort of subthread. And of course, you can train AI on more specific corpuses. But the default one is just on this enormous sort of ongoing scraping of this the web and other databases. Converts that all into tokens, and then uses that to figure out the probability between those tokens / words in terms of how it's been used in natural language, and then predicting then how that's going to work. So we're all familiar with this just on our phones from predictive text. That times 1,000,000 or 1,000,000,000 is what we're looking at with ChatGPT. And so it's all about probabilities and statistics. So I sometimes say that what we really have in ChatGPT is a numbers and statistical sort of marvel more than a language marvel, but it's the intersection of those two things. And so these models can only predict the probabilities between words, and they have no idea really about what the meaning is, even though it seems that way. Given that, that basic sort of most simple reductive of overviews, it doesn't mean that these models aren't powerful. And I'm going to apologize for a few slides here that are way too text dense, especially for those of you working on a small screen right now. So I'll try to read things aloud. But I wanted to make this seminar today. The promise was like, where are we today? And so I want to tell you where I am today. And one of the things I'm doing today is teaching a course on travel writing that started last week. And it's an online asynchronous course, but a course that's also fairly interactive, where I'm on discussion boards with students, where I'm having some conferences with students, where they're doing live synchronous peer review of their travel essays. But for me, this is live. This is happening right now. It's a course I started just last week. And I want to give you a piece of student writing that came into a discussion board just last week. And let me say something first, is that knowing what I know about AI and writing, I took some parts of this course and tried to redesign them over the last several weeks before I started it. Even though I think it was a pretty well-designed course with my colleague, Ellen Littman, I did redesign some assignments and some of the activities in the course with AI in mind. Not paranoid, not trying to just do surveillance, but really trying to think about the realities of who would be in this course, which is 19 students. So at UConn here, when we have a writing course, which this one is, we limit it to 19. And I actually want to get back by the end of this to talking about course size, because that ultimately is going to matter, I think, for what we're talking about today. Teaching of writing always is affected by the size of the course you're teaching. Any course is, right? The quality of discussion and so on. But I actually want to make an argument later on that I think AI actually creates another argument for us to have smaller, more interactive seminar style classes. But this class that I was teaching, I was trying to make as much like a live seminar already, and I've taught it for 3 or 4 years now. But here's a discussion group post, first one actually, of the class. And I don't give you the prompt, I just give you the discussion with the one student's response. So the prompt was the kind of prompt that I thought might be kind of AI ChatGPT proof, which was take this video project from the New York Times, their Voyages issues in 2018, which is really cool, kind of looking at travel sights and sounds in an innovative way, connect it to the introduction to the best American travel writing that year, which is actually arguing that this is kind of a threat to the traditional kinds of travel writing, and then connect that again to one of the other travel essays that we're reading in this module. So I was asking students to connect 3 things, pretty specific to this course, pretty complex for a first posting of the semester, but I was trying to send a message to students also that, hey, this is a course where you're going to need to connect scholarly work on travel writing, contemporary travel writers and what they're doing, and the other contextual issues around this whole field that we're introducing ourselves to. Here's what a student gave me, and I've marked in red the places that made me go, huh. The typical response, by the way, was no signs of ChatGPT except in about how many of the 19 responses? Well, 2, which actually reaches that same percentage of students who say they're using this, about 10%, right? So that might predict that about 2 students out of 19 would use it. And that's exactly what I was kind of seeing here. So what does this do? It's not a bad, it's actually a perfectly grammatical response. And it's saying, take this quote from Jason Wilson, which the student would have had to go in and look for and pick one, connect it to the New York Times audiovisual piece. And where I started getting my own sort of sense of, this doesn't sound like a student voice very much, was like, our interconnectedness with people from diverse backgrounds are central themes. The multimedia experience highlights the power of travel to broaden perspectives and cultivate empathy, emphasizing the importance of recognizing ourselves as active participants in a global community. Okay, that's fine. That's kind of kind of what we're going for here. And then it makes a connection to a story that we've been reading. But the real mark was the Scottish lesson is not written by Mark Sundin. It's actually, and it's not really about the author's personal self-discovery while hiking. It is kind of like AI is smart enough to know that the author who put in clearly the prompt for this and prompted it with the Scottish lesson knows that when people write travel writing about Scotland, they're often talking about the outdoors, and there might be something about hiking in there. And there is actually in the story that was actually read here, but it was by a different author. And AI kept things so general here that I started saying, come on, if a student read this story, they would know that it's about a boyfriend breaking up with the writer and her being distraught while she's on a student study abroad trip to Scotland, which is not the typical travel narrative, but it's the one that students comment on all the time because they can identify with your boyfriend breaking up with you or your partner breaking up with you. And putting that in the context of travel was the new part of this that I was trying to send the message that travel writing can come out of all these sort of personal places and situations. But you'll notice when it starts to mesh all these things together, it becomes kind of a sort of like souped up high school essay that traffics in generalizations. But it's not that it's dumb, it gets the name wrong, and that's dumb because what AI will do is hallucinate. It will go with the probability of that Mark Sundin being the author, and he's a real author, by the way. So it didn't make up Mark Sundin as an author. And Mark Sundin is an author who has written about travel in Scotland. So the probability says that, well, let's just attach this name to it because AI and ChatGPT knows that when you introduce a short story title, you should introduce the author. So it's going to get that right. Whether it gets the right author for an unfamiliar story is the probability goes down as it did here. So that was the real giveaway here. But I think I would have found this was the case anyway, because the author didn't really understand the connection between the New York Times piece and the quote that even she selected. And then the confirmation was just how it got into this gobbledygook here that was all just highly stylized in general in a way that read like not a sort of a composite of all the sort of B- essays that you might have received in a class like this. And then it almost always ends with a typical kind of sentence that AI knows that most essays end with. Overall, both this text and this text align with this other text, because that was the prompt you gave me, to do something very general, like foster a sense of interconnectedness, reminding us of our responsibilities and obligations and as participants in a global community, right? So my question to you is, what would you do if you were given this, if you encountered this? Because I encountered this just 5 days ago. And I want to make use of the collective wisdom of this group to ask, how would you deal with it? If you could put that in the chat in just a moment. And I'll give you a little bit of context. Oops, sorry, this is in the context of a course where there is already a policy on AI, because I knew that that was coming. So this went into my policies in the spring, and it went into my policies for this course. So here's my own academic integrity statement. And as I read this, I'd like you to be thinking about how would you respond to that discussion post that you're pretty sure. In fact, the hallucination of the name confirms that it's AI. And by the way, one of the things that will be most revealing about ChatGPT is it makes up sources. It'll sometimes use the same title, but attach it to a different author, or it will just do a source that sounds right. The citations will be perfectly formatted, but they, as people who are really familiar with your subfield, you will just know that this person didn't write this, or you can check it out quickly and find out, but students won't know. So here's my academic integrity statement. Here's how it stood at the top before last spring. And here's the part that I added starting in January of 2023. So again, think about what you would do with that student with the discussion post, and then put it in the chat while I read this. So in this course, we aim to conduct ourselves as a community of scholars and writers, recognizing that academic study is both an intellectual and ethical enterprise. You're encouraged to build on the ideas and texts of others. And then I tell students what they can do to do that. It's fine to go to the Writing Center. In fact, please go to the Writing Center. It's fine for you to sort of cite other sources. You just need to cite them. And of course, I even want to help you cite other people in the class. So I give them a little coaching in that. The part that I added for this course was, you are welcome to use AI tools such as ChatGPT on most assignments, and I'll alert you when you can't. And I didn't say they couldn't use it for the discussion board. So the student is not out of bounds on that count. But whenever you use them, you must include an acknowledgement statement that briefly states that and how you use them. Maybe this is a pipe dream here, but this is my policy here. For example, and then I give them an example of how they could talk about using ChatGPT. You'll notice that the student didn't do that. Please note that all large language models, and this is a piece that I'm borrowing from Ryan Baker at UPenn, and I try to give credit for that. It's not his exact words, but it's close. Please also note that large language models still have a tendency to make up incorrect facts and fake citations. You will be responsible for any inaccurate, biased, offensive, or otherwise unethical content you submit, regardless of whether it originally comes from an AI tool. And then I try to credit that to the speaker. And then I try to give them a little bit of advice. Please note that AI tools tend to be pretty bad at the kinds of creative writing and course-specific writing we're going to be doing in this course. So let's look at the chat and see what folks have come up with as a possibility for what you might do. Go down to the bottom. So Catherine, thank you. I would also ask the student if, I don't think you guys can see the chat, or maybe you can or can't, but I'm going to repeat the sort of response to this scenario of just 3 or 4 people. I would also ask the student if I could use the response as an example of why you need to edit in the future, in future courses. Okay. I had one student whose final paper would look suspicious, but the AI checking website stated that AI was not AI produced. Yeah, I'm actually not going to talk a lot today about AI detection software, because I think it's a dead end. I didn't get in to be a professor to get into a surveillance war with my students about checking technologies. I don't like Turnitin.com and all the plagiarism checking things. I just think there are far better ways to deal with this. So I understand that people may disagree with me on that. We can talk more about that. But that case that Raphael notes is one of the reasons why that the software isn't all that good. So Jeffrey Akbar, thank you for, as noted in the syllabus, students are responsible for inaccurate information. Additionally, they're obliged to confirm ChatGPT use. Therefore, the student will be penalized for these violations. Pretty clear, right? I would also just talk to them, says Jennifer, about how they failed to acknowledge their use of it and why it's so easy to spot. They may have forgotten that they were allowed to use it in this instance. Remember, this is the first week of the course, which might be a different response than I would have, or maybe Jennifer would have, in the 5th week of an intensive course. I'm always a little more educational and forgiving in the first few weeks till they get the hang of what my course is about and what the standards are and so on. So I like that. Ellen, there you are. So Ellen Littman is a co-creator of this course, and she is in the group. So I didn't know that you were going to be here, Ellen Littman. So for one, I would point out to the student that their discussion post shows that they haven't read the essay in question. And Ellen, I know Ellen knows this essay because she is the co-creator and teaches this course every other year. So, all right, so you point out, it's clear you haven't read the Scottish lesson, and you'll see how I did that. Whoops. All right, so we've got I'm going to do one more. Steve Adler. I would, confirm via AI detector site. I don't think I need to do that, Steve, but you're welcome to. I mean, to have a one-on-one with the student to review the university's AI policy, and 3, get the student's perspective on using their critical thinking. So I love 2 and 3 on there, but I didn't feel too much obligation. And in fact, I don't want to take too much of my time chasing down AI detectors, but I respect that Steve may want to do that. Okay, so great ideas there, and there are many more that I cannot get to that I invite you to see from the collective wisdom of the room. Here's what I did do. Now, this was within our course management system. So this is a message that went directly to the student when I was grading this piece. The other context for this is that I schedule a conference with the students in the first week of class. That's with 2 other students, so I can get to know them and talk about whether they have questions about the class. This is possible because we have a 19-student class, and I can have small group meetings of 2 and 3, even in an asynchronous online class. So even as I'm writing this, I'm knowing, Isabella is going to be in a conference with me and 1 or 2 other students, 5 days from now. So what I said was, Isabella, I'm a bit puzzled by your post. Wilson doesn't see the New York Times multimedia piece as real travel writing. So that was just wrong. AI got it wrong, because typically when you're trying to connect things, it's because they're similar, right? And so the probability is that the AI is assuming that if you cite one thing and try to connect it to another, you're trying to show some kind of synthesis. But in this case, it was not the probable connection. It was that Jason Wilson was critiquing the New York Times piece as a threat. And so this is my way of getting partly at what Ellen talked about, which is, I'm not sure you really read this stuff. And instead he quotes, so I tell her what I saw is simply wrong here. And the Scottish lesson is not written by Mon. He's not in this module at all. I'm not sure where that came from. And that's where I just sort of say, like, via ChatGPT, perhaps, like, even though I know, I'm not coming out here to sort of slam students or make big accusations in the first week of class, but I want them to know that I know this stuff well enough, and you should have known it even as an initial reading. If you read the Scottish lesson, you know that it's about something more particular than illuminating our shared humanity. Best to avoid, and this is where I'm getting a little snarky, vague blather like that phrase. I'd prefer to hear your real voice. And so I'm trying to be a little bit of the kind of coach and curmudgeon here, which is probably consonant with my teaching persona. And I guess all the advice I ever give people about teaching writing is that it has to be in some ways consonant with your own teaching values and persona. And so I don't want to just punish students. I want them to learn. But at the same time, I want them to be aware that this is not a place where you can fake your way through a course with me. So we also had a discussion the next week. I can't remember if I put much in about that discussion. Okay, let me go back for a minute. So in the discussion with Isabella the next week, this is happening in the context of a 3-conference person. Should I bring up this or just deal with this privately with her? That would be one option, to have a separate conference the way that I think Steve suggested. Personally, again, I want to acknowledge that you guys are all busy faculty members or teachers who might not have time to do individual extra conferences beyond what you've already built in. So I wanted to deal with this within the context of a course that I felt that Ellen and I designed pretty carefully to include some conferences. And so I just brought this up in the 3-person conference. And I said, we did introductions, we talked a little bit, I asked, and then I said, okay, I had a little bit of feedback for each student on their first discussion board posts. And for Isabella's, I was just candid about saying, what did you think about my response? Because I thought it smelled like ChatGPT, and where did Mark Sunstein come from? And what did she say? What did she say? First of all, context matters here, right? Isabella was at work full-time doing this conference. In fact, the beginning of the conference was her saying, oh, I need to find a private place to actually have our conference, even though it was just 15 minutes. And I asked the students a little bit about their lives at the beginning of the conference. And what I learned was she's working full-time this summer. She's taking 2 other classes. And she's stressed out. And so I was just remarking, saying, that sounds like way too much for taking an intensive summer class that's supposed to be 20+ hours a week on top of full-time work. And 2 other classes? That sounds impossible to me. And she's like, yeah. And I panicked, and I was way behind a deadline, and I'm sorry, and I screwed up, and I won't do that again. And she hasn't in the future bulletin board posts. And I think that was not meant to bring shame upon her. Like she was actually pretty good natured about it and just said, yeah, I know, but I felt okay having that conversation in the context of 2 other students where we were talking about everybody's strengths and weaknesses and in a spirit of learning. Others may feel differently, that they don't have the time to do that, or they would have dealt with it one-on-one, and I respect that. I'm just trying to give you a realistic sense of what I'm trying to do. And I also want to give a realistic sense of, I don't think we want to create conditions where ChatGPT just creates a lot more labor for faculty who have to go into this kind of surveillance mode. And again, that's just not what I want to do as a teacher. So I'm trying to figure out ways to not do that. But you'll notice I tried to build structurally into the course a regular conference in the first week of classes after this happened. And the first week of an intensive summer class is really the equivalent of about the third week of a 15-week seminar. So I would encourage you to think about things like that in your teaching. How much are you building in small group or individual conferences with students where you can actually talk about these things? If this were a live class, we'd be having more of these conversations in the classroom before they actually even did discussion posts, where ChatGPT wouldn't really be the temptation or the issue that it is for an online class. So even the modality of the class may speak to how you're thinking about course design for this fall, perhaps, when you're redesigning your class this summer. Do you want to build in more conferences? Do you want to build in more pre-writing activities? Do you want to have students, as I'll suggest later, do things that are more discussion-based, presentation-based in tandem with their writing, which is harder to do in an online class? I don't have all the answers, but this was my one very recent contextual answer to this issue. Let's talk together a little bit about possible course design and pedagogical responses. So let me just say one thing that I was thinking about already with this particular course that didn't work, but it worked a little bit, but it didn't work great. So one of the course design changes I had made from last time I taught this course 2 years ago till now was I actually did fewer of those discussion boards like the one you saw with Isabella just now. And I did more perusal postings, which is a social annotation software, right? Like Hypothesis or Annotate, Perusal. If you're familiar with those, I was kind of figuring, I kind of like those anyway. And I was figuring the temptation to ChatGPT is going to be smaller inside the Perusal. And by the way, Perusal does have some kind of creepy but useful surveillance mechanisms of telling you how much time a student spends on a text and how much they read through and so on. So I said, I'm just going to use a little more Perusal than discussion boards. And I think that's working because it still gives the spirit of students really interacting with the text. But I still got about that 10% of smells like ChatGPT with this really long essay-like response, trafficking in those vague generalities. But when we're discussing a text that's much better known than the Scottish lesson, like Cheryl Strayed's Wild, it certainly gets the author correct and it gets more of the content correct because there's more training data out there on more popular books. So it wasn't hallucinating in the way it did with Mark Sundin as the wrong author for that short story that's less familiar, or that travel essay that's less familiar. But it did just, they were just too long, they were too generic voiced. And so I was just, even within Perusal, I was kind of like, this doesn't fit in with the rest because it doesn't sound like a conversation that we're having in Perusal. And so for that, I did just ping the students individually and say, come on, don't do that. And again, some of those students were, I don't know why, I don't know the motives behind it, but some of them were students who were speaking English as a second or third language. And then the temptation might be greater if you're working outside your most comfortable language to use things like Perusal, things like ChatGPT. So the other things we can do is make our course policies about AI explicit and discuss them with students. I think it's not enough to have the syllabus language like I put in there, but actually have a discussion of that. Now that's harder to do in an online asynchronous course, but it's pretty easy to do if you schedule time in, even with a large course, in the first week or two of classes. Some of the other suggestions are creating very context-specific and course-specific assignments. Now, I think Ellen and I tried to do that with this course anyway. That's not going to be a safeguard for sure, but I think it will take care of a lot. So I think all of us should be rethinking our assignments for the fall, and at the very least, running them through ChatGPT. So if you were among in that poll, that group that said, I've used it once, or I haven't used it at all, which was what, 30, 40, 50% of you, start using it, start getting familiar with it. And the place you can start is just plugging in your course assignments and then slight variations on that assignment, and also run your same assignment through multiple times. Because ChatGPT will never produce the same response exactly twice, right? That's part of the virtue of it in some ways, as well as the bane of it if you're looking for detection. So I ran it through multiple times. And even so, students may use it, but it's going to be much harder to use if you have something in your assignment that says, based on the discussions we've been having in class the last 2 weeks, pull something another student said, integrate it with this text, and discuss this larger concept about international relations. Hey, ChatGPT can make a go at that kind of thing, but it's going to be clumsy. It's going to hallucinate. And maybe ChatGPT will get better, but the more context specific you can be with your assignments, the better. Integrate live presentations, student conferences, oral exams, multimodal composing, class discussion, low stakes writing, pre-writing, proposal writing, peer review. Some of these things you guys already do, I hope, because you've been just paying attention to good pedagogical practice for years, but you might have to pay a little more deliberate attention to them. And I'll give you a link to the, if our folks could give a link to these slides, that'd be great. There'll be a few links that people can follow later. There's even a small bit on oral exams that I did with, I think, an ISA member, Jamie Free, 10 or 12 years ago, thinking about oral exams before we even thought about this. Almost all the things that we're going to recommend to AI proof your course, if you're thinking in those terms, I would say 95% of them are just good teaching practices or institutional practices like small classes that you might not have full control over, but we should seize the opportunity to make those arguments in the context of what could just be a moral panic about this that could be converted into better conversations about course design, teaching, and institutional working conditions. So thanks. So Mary included the link. So if you want to take a look at even something that Jamie and I were doing sort of 10, 12 years ago, having, informal conversations with students in your office is really hard for ChatGPT to get in the middle of that conversation. But at the same time, it's really hard to have those conversations if you've got a 200-person lecture. I understand that as well. So I'm not giving one prescription as a solution here. I want to open the discussion and offer some options. And the final things I want to say is that, so let's do what writing across curriculum folks have been recommending for 50 years. This was advertised as a writing across the curriculum, writing across the disciplines kind of approach. And that's my field. That's what I've been working on. And anybody who's been in workshops with me or anybody who's read about writing across the curriculum at your own institutions would know things that we've been recommending since the 1970s, which is, and here's a statement from the IWAC, Association for Writing Across the Curriculum. I'm just quoting one part of it. Current AI discussions remind us yet again of long established best practices in writing across the curriculum, grounded in research and extant for decades. Designing meaningful and specific assignments, focusing on processes. So have students do more writing about how they wrote with cover letters and cover notes, right? Engage them in a more iterative process of writing where they're not creating a paper from scratch the night before. You've seen a proposal. They're doing drafts that go through peer review. These are not foolproof, but they're going to create the conditions for good teaching, good learning, less temptation to do what Isabella did because she's working full time, she's pressed with other classes, and she's kind of fuzzy on what this whole technology is and heard good things about it and just jumps in and does it, right? All the things we've been talking about writing across curriculum for decades really work, low tech and high tech, but maybe especially at this moment. So this is not the time for your universities to be cutting down on their faculty development or their writing across curriculum people. It is the time to be doing more of that. So I want to take a look at the chat if we could, because the other thing I asked for was, what are your ideas about this? Oops, I'm sorry. I've already given away some of my ones here, that this might be a chance for us to advocate for smaller class caps. You might say that's totally unrealistic, but why can't we at least make that argument, or at least an argument against the erosion of what might work here? I don't want to lose the thread of what these technologies might mean for neurodiverse writers, because I've heard such compelling stories from my colleagues and friends about how thinking about just policing these technologies can actually hurt those students who may use ChatGPT very strategically and honestly and openly to advance their learning, right? But and I want to know what else. So I'm going to just read one or two things that I'm getting from the chat, and I would encourage you at this point. We're 50 minutes in. You've been listening to me talk a lot. I really want to know what you think are the kind of what else, in addition to some of those traditional WAC principles, the assignment design, the wider variety of modalities students could write in or present in the chat. So I'm going to start with, oops, I'm sorry. I'll start with Jennifer. I experimented with my assignment prompts in ChatGPT, and it could handle everything but a request to use examples from their own lives. Yes, thank you. It told me explicitly it was not capable of providing personal examples, which I thought was a good example of how we might make more course-specific assignments. Thank you, Jennifer. That actually is one of the things that I was thinking about for my next course assignment for this same travel writing course. I gave them an example of a travel essay where someone's saying, this part of my personal identity changes the way I think about travel. And this was an essay by Molly Mulcully Brown about how her cognitive neurological issues and disabilities shape the way she travels. And I said, think about that. And students are coming up with all kinds of cool ways. Like I've got, just this morning, I read one where a student said, you know, I'm in the Army, and when I wear my uniform, it creates a different sense of travel in terms of how people respond to me. And I've had students be very open about saying, my mental health and anxiety issues have really shaped the way I travel, and here's one experience where that happens. So the personal, this might be a way to get back to the personal as it's integrated with our disciplinary concerns. I'm going to read one from Marianne Gallagher. And I haven't pre-read these, so I'm coming at you live here. What are your thoughts on using ChatGPT as the first step, not the, I'm sorry, thoughts on using GPT as the final step, not the first step in writing? Great. I think you need to think about how ChatGPT could work at any stage. So it's actually quite good at editing. If you even just put a thing and say, edit this for X, Y, or Z. But it's also quite good at generating ideas. So one of the things you could say is generate 10 ideas for this prompt, and then have the students kind of negotiate which 3 or 4 of those are total crap, which 2 or 3 of those kind of cool, and which 2 or 3 maybe, but we need to talk more about them. So the way students are using and the way professionals are using ChatGPT with writing is not just at that last stage, but it's going to be, there are different ways to use it at the beginning, middle, and end. And if you go to the slide presentation, there's a whole bunch of ways we're experimenting with it in the Writing Center at those different stages that I wasn't really planning to get to today because we're already approaching an hour, but you could take a look at how we've been experimenting with those at those various stages. I think even if we say only use it at the final stage, students are going to use it in all kinds of ways. So we need to at least be conscious of that. Let's see. Let's look at one other example in the chat, if I could find one. So Raphael said, I did something I did last summer. I spoke to the students about the importance of developing their writing skills over having the perfect end product and how I value effort in my grading. I've been saying that explicitly too, because I've got a couple of students who are from China in my current travel writing course. And I think some of their use of AI is this fear that in the discussion boards, if they make a grammatical mistake, that they're somehow going to be stigmatized. So I've tried to be explicit about saying, I really want to hear your voice in here, and grammar doesn't matter in the discussion boards. I'd rather see a real idea and some, sort of an accent in your writing than a perfectly smoothed out, what I called that kind of generalized blather that ChatGPT tends to produce. So I like Raphael's solution as well. Jeremy, I'll read one too. In a writing intensive course, I find my central challenge is to cover the topical substance and writing elements. So hard to devote more time to the AI related writing issues without sacrificing topical substance. Amen, yes. But that, Jeremy, I think is a problem I've been hearing about in my workshops for 20 years, both at UConn and at Haverford when I was before there. That's not an AI issue specifically. It's a teaching and learning issue more generally, and AI certainly adds more pressure to it and a new angle to it. But I would suggest that some of the older solutions to that have been, well, maybe you just need to assign less stuff in terms of coverage and go deeper into fewer things, which is one solution that may work for some classes, but might not work for like a big survey class. So all I can do is nod my head and say, yeah, talk about that, think about that this summer, and what could go, because I do think we need to be adamant with ourselves, with our departments, and with our colleges and universities that you can't just add another layer of labor to faculty without giving them some time and space to work on that, just as you can't add another layer to a course that's already full without letting something go, probably. So if you're going to have conferences, what's going to go? Maybe a lecture or two instead of conferences with students. Is that a trade-off you're willing to make? Less lecture time in class versus a small group conference? For me, the answer is usually yes, but not for every class I teach, because that depends on the course goals, the agenda for that class, what the department needs from me in that class. Okay. All right, we're rounding the corner to 1 hour, and I want to just ask one. I didn't want this seminar to be about how to use AI better, but for those who want to, I do want to just get a sense, because I'm curious about one more thing, and then we'll raise wide open to questions. Can we do the quick poll, Kate or others, on prompt engineering? I just want to know, how familiar are you with the term prompt engineering? And just pick one of the three answers here that's the most familiar to you, because this is something I didn't know about until last summer, and didn't know about when I was first experimenting with ChatGPT ahead of when with regular GPT before ChatGPT came out. So maybe you don't know at all what it is. So say, what the heck is that? I've heard of it, but don't know much about it. Or yeah, you already do prompt engineering and you pretty much know what it is. Okay. Put that poll in. Why don't we close the poll? See the results. Okay, so most people don't know what it is, but there's a very few who do know what it is, and a few who are kind of fuzzy on it. So I want to just spend 2 or 3 minutes on prompt engineering, because I think this can be part of your experimentation with AI this summer. And one of my recommendations is simply, this is a tool that more of us have to move into that. At least I'm trying and experimenting with it, rather than just stepping back and holding back from understanding what it really produces. All right, so prompt engineering. The good news about prompt engineering is if you're really good about it, you can probably leave your academic job and get a really high-paying job at 3 or 4 times your salary in the tech industry right now, because it's critical to all kinds of AI. But if you want to stay in your job, and if you want to just use ChatGPT or even teach your students to use ChatGPT, you need to know about prompt engineering. And prompt engineering, if you think back to how AI works, even in that most basic sense of token and statistics, is a way to narrow the context for your inquiry so that you get a more fitting response. So the way most people use ChatGPT is the way that it's out there in the press, like write an essay for me about the causes of the Civil War, right? And it will write you a standard essay on that, or even connect this travel writing piece to this one, and ChatGPT will be using the entire corpus to try to best piece those together into what it thinks you're asking for. But if you tell ChatGPT to play a role, it will do much better. And this is as simple as saying, as the first step, not telling ChatGPT what you want it to do, but who you want it to be for that particular chat. So you might say, I want you to act as my career mentor, and then give me advice on best careers for people who do this, this, and this. That would be a kind of life coaching way. Now, the fourth one is the one that's more familiar that you should use, or that your students might want to use, is take on the role of a professor of international relations. So immediately ChatGPT is thinking, I'm limiting my corpus more to international relations. I'm thinking more like an academic, and it's going to activate more of those genres and probabilities that are closer to what professors do. And then you give the same prompt you would have. So I think you would, I think so. Isn't that last one familiar? But it's familiar to you, but it's not familiar to ChatGPT. So I would encourage you to take the same prompt without prompt engineering and just put it into ChatGPT, and then try it with the first few other prompts. And by the way, this looks like, let me just show you some things we're doing in the Writing Center. This might look like this. I want you to play the role of a professor in animal nutrition. And AI will say things like, sure, I can play that role for you. It's very friendly, right? It's very accommodating. And it'll tell you, as a professor, it'll often spit out a little bit longer answer than you want. And then you just use the next field to say, okay, now I want to ask this question about a summary of an article in animal nutrition. Let me go back for a minute here now. Oops. So how do you do that? You give the ChatGPT an identity, you be as specific as possible, and then the other thing you can do is guide the ChatGPT through every step of the writing process. So if you get a response that says it's kind of general, you can just then say to ChatGPT, make the response shorter and more specific and more concise, and integrate this text, which you didn't include, and then it will rewrite that essay that it just wrote, or that summary, or whatever you asked it to do. But if you give it an identity, give it a genre, do you want it to write an abstract? Do you want it to write a college essay? Do you want it to write an introduction section or method sections to an article? It's going to get much better real fast. And then if you use it iteratively, like you don't have to take the first one. You can say, well, rewrite that much shorter, or rewrite that for an audience that has an 8th grade reading ability, and it will revise that. Or rewrite that to include Cheryl Strayed's Wild, because I think that text is going to work better than the one you hallucinated that doesn't exist. All of that assumes a kind of critical user that understands a little bit of AI, how it works, and why context is important. So if you want to train your students to use AI better, this is what you may want to do. And you should probably be aware that students are already doing this. I don't know if people saw in the Chronicle of Higher Ed, this piece by a Columbia student, who actually shows you not great prompt engineering, but nice iterative uses of refining results while trying to produce a paper on the Iliad that you'll see. And it's a nice, the student is using it actually as a kind of negative example. Like, you don't know your students are doing this kind of ChatGPT. Like Isabella, that example I gave you, she wasn't doing these things. But if she had actually done better prompt engineering, and if she had refined it after reading it the first time, she would have come up with a better answer, right? And you have to decide for yourself if you want to teach your students to do this, but you should be aware of prompt engineering at least. Okay, we are at more than an hour. And at this point, in these kinds of seminars, people start dropping away because your attention spans start waning, or you've got other commitments. If you've got a link to the presentation, so there's some links we didn't pursue in there, and there are others that are from a presentation I gave with some undergraduates about how we're just starting to use ChatGPT, teaching students how to use it critically and ethically in small situations where you ask it very specific things like, come up with 2 different ways to write this paragraph that I've already written, that you can browse on your own. But I would encourage you at this point to ask a few questions in the chat. I think we'll take 1 or 2 or 3 of them, and then we'll sign off once enthusiasm wanes a little bit, and let you get back to your summer lives of teaching and research, and hopefully doing something besides teaching and research. So Mary and others, were there any questions that we missed going back in the chat that I wouldn't have seen that you think are particularly important for us to bring to the forefront at this point?
Nothing showed up in the Q&A. I didn't see any questions in the chat either that weren't direct responses to some input questions that you asked for. So, okay,
thanks. So why don't we generate some fresh ones? You can hopefully generate those right from your own fingertips rather than your own intelligence, not the artificial intelligence, although you could go to ChatGPT. By the way, the other things that ChatGPT is really good at that might be really quick things, like I have students who will put a whole like poster or paper in a thing and say, could you come up with a good title for this? And it's really good at that. It's sometimes, or can we come up with 3 different titles? And 9 times out of 10, even for grad students, it comes up with a better title than they produced. But they usually, I like to use ChatGPT in a way that says, generate 3 versions of this for me, generate multiple versions, and then let me choose, combine, synthesize, or reject. Because I know that it's not better than me at most things, but hey, sometimes I'm stuck with a grad student coaching them through like, how do we say this better? We could sit here for 20 minutes kind of working through this paragraph, and maybe we need to do that just as the process for you to learn this, and I'll commit to that. But other times I'll say like, hey, maybe we should just take this one really naughty sentence and ask ChatGPT to come up with 3 different ways to say it and see if we would like any of those or reject those, which is a very interactive way of using it, and which is one of the reasons why in the title to this discussion, I used the word with. It was writing and teaching with AI, because I think ultimately we're moving towards a world where hybrid writing, human AI, machine writing is going to be pretty common. It already is quite common in lots of domains, but how to critically and actively use it is, of course, our big question. Okay, so let's see these questions from Mariah. There are so many chat apps for ChatGPT. Is there one you would recommend? I am not enough of a connoisseur of all these to tell you which one is best. Obviously, ChatGPT is the most common, but one you may want to try is Open Assistant because it's open source. So I was working through the State Department English language programs this past spring with academics writing and publishing in English more effectively. And in Russia, you can't get ChatGPT, or at least you can't get it without a VPN. But Open Assistant, which is open source and not for profit, works pretty well. So you're obviously going to get Google's coming out with its own AI. You're going to have, the Bing AI stuff. You've got ChatGPT. There's the different versions of GPT that some of which are free and some of which are pay. But I would try Open Assistant as one alternative that's a little off the beaten path, a little less known, but still pretty darn effective. And it's also a software that is asking for your participation to help train the data. So it's a kind of collective user built one. So I'll try to find that and put the link of that someone could. It works a lot like ChatGPT. I don't have the link right now because I got my screen with the slides on it, but you could find it.
Tom, we have a question in the Q&A.
Yeah, please.
It says, how would you deal with a situation in which you suspect AI was used, but a student denies it? I'm thinking also of situations in which students supersede expectations, sometimes in the context of implicit biases that professors might have against minority students.
Yeah, so probably two different questions there, right? I mean, the simplest, but the sort of snarky answer to the first one is, yeah, you build these course safeguards and encouragements and incentives in so that it doesn't happen. But when it does happen, how do you, I need to work with this. My way is to simply say, walk me through how you did it. And if they can't, or if I ask them a few particular questions about it, I might just say, like, what does this mean? So I think the simple exchange, I don't think it's good to get in like email back and forth about this. I don't think it's great. Like I opened that conversation with Isabella that I showed earlier, in part because I knew that I would be meeting with her in a conference later. If that were during a regular semester, I would have just told the student, let's chat before or after class or during my office hours and walk me through it. And if they can't do that, it's just like any other plagiarism issue, where I try to approach it in an educational way. Let's say the student really digs in their heels and says, but I wrote it, but I can't explain it. At that point, I just kind of call bullshit on that. And they say, like, that doesn't make sense to me. You're not going to get credit for this, but you can make it up if you wish. And if they want to take that up through the judicial system, I'll tell them we can do that. It's not my preference. It's pretty rare, but I would give them all the opportunities to explain themselves, to try to not make it big and threatening, and to try to deal with this early in the semester so that we can set ourselves up for success later on. Mary, could you repeat the last part of that one about the implicit biases? Because it's really important, but I don't remember the front end of it.
Sure. He said, I'm thinking also of situations in which students supersede expectations, sometimes in the context of implicit biases that professors might have against minority students.
Yeah. So this could work in a couple directions. Like this is too good of a piece of writing for you, and that you may be sort of, there may be implicit bias in terms of who's expected to really outperform or not. Well, I think as we all know, AI is a replicator of bias and polarization. No one knows that better probably than political scientists and international relations folks who have seen it go awry in political contexts, right? And all the misinformation that's out there. So the first thing is AI is not going to save us from any of that, and it's going to make it worse. So we have to work with that. And it's not going to solve it on the human scale that question implies. So all I would say to that is that we need to keep talking about that and making it part of our faculty development, and ask yourselves, when you're really suspecting that a student is using this, talk to them about it and make sure that you're doing your best to do that equitably across the classroom. I've had to be really careful to check and balance this with, say, my Chinese students, where it's easy to assume that they're going to struggle with language or travel writing in the American English tradition, because that's not where as much of their experience is. But I have to keep reminding myself, wait a minute. The wonderful thing about that group of students in my class right now, and it's about 3 or 4 of the students who are international students in my class, is that they have all kinds of great travel experience that I just need to remind them that they can activate. And I have to remind myself what ethically it means to work in a second language, and that writing with an accent, to me, is just as welcome as speaking with an accent. So I'm working hard to against my own potential and cultural biases there about students, and that's something we just got to work on together, I think.
We have another question in the Q&A. It says, is there anything else you would add in the case of large introductory classes?
Yeah. I'd love to hear from the group about that, because I don't teach many large introductory classes, or any really. Even if I'm teaching an introductory class in the English department, it's usually for a group of about 30 or 40, where I can see their writing, where we can have discussions. So I would love to hear what others have to say about that. I've been in the awkward position of sometimes telling folks, maybe we need to really rethink if writing is the best way to get at the kinds of critical thinking that we all value. In an AI world with a really large class, I still think there are writing across curriculum techniques in a large class. For example, when you have students just do some informal writing in class and then pair up and talk about it, right? That's an old think, pair, share, or write, pair, share strategy that can work in a small class and a big class. But what I definitely wouldn't do in a big class is just have a paper due at the end of the semester with no warm-up. Even if you can't do lots of peer review, but by the way, peer review is pretty scalable because you don't have to be in every session. Think about the things that are scalable, like peer review, and think about things that are not, perhaps like conferences, and do your best to adjust the assignments and the nature of the assignments. Making those assignments super contextual to your lectures might be helpful. But what are other ideas that others have? Because for those who have more experience with large introductory classes, I'd love for you to put that in the chat. Are you using, some faculty are panicking and taking all writing out, which I don't think is what I want to see. Oh, let me go back here. Yeah. Okay, I think we should probably wrap up because it is at the 15-minute mark after the hour. You've been thoughtful and patient in your comments. I appreciate all the engagement there. I think we did include a link to the presentation if you want to look a little deeper into the writing center work. And if you got comments or response on that for me, I'd love to hear it, because we haven't really run that by faculty yet. And I'm kind of curious about what faculty think about that. But thank you so much for inviting me today. And we all have work to do this summer as we get ready to teach our fall classes in particular. I wish you well in all of that.
Thank you so much for being here with us. For everyone who's worried about the slides, we intend to email everyone who has signed up for this webinar once we have the recording ready and posted on our YouTube channel. And in that message, we'll also give you a link to the slides in case you've lost it. You don't have to worry, and any of the resources that Tom might want to provide. So please feel free to contact us in the meantime if there's anything that you think you missed. And thank you all for being here, and have a lovely rest of your week.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye, everybody.